This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Haig.
This is the Books Podcast, and the book we're talking about today is Alwyn W Turner's The Last Post. And yes, we are talking about the bugle call here. Alwyn, thank you very much. Welcome to the Books Podcast.
Thanks very much.
Now, there is in the human race a very strong tendency to what I always think of as the teleological fallacy, by which I mean that we tend to think if something stands for something, it always has, and it always meant to. That it was intended by whom I never know, but that it was, it was like that from the beginning. And the Last Post is this iconic tune played on a bugle that we all associate with, well, military funerals, but yeah, other funerals as well. It wasn't always, though, was it? It didn't start out. Nobody intended it for that to be.
No, it didn't. It didn't get used as a funeral for at least half a century from when it was first introduced into the British Army. It was just one of dozens of bugle calls that were played every day at a time when no soldier would be expected to carry a watch, and therefore you had to provide signals to tell people what time of day it was, what was happening, where they ought to be in camp. And it was just one of, as I say, about 24 calls played every single day of a soldier's life.
It is also it's a plangent and evocative tune. So,
it is now because it's been associated with that, and also because the style of playing it has changed. The music is the same as it always was, but it used to be played much faster. It used to take about 45 seconds to play the Last Post.
Make it jaunty.
And yeah, it does. It does sound quite cheerful. When you hear it played at that speed, and you try to strip out all the generations of associations that you have with it. But the way it is now played, the notes are held for longer, the pauses are held for longer. It takes about 1.25 minutes to play. So an extra 30 seconds on top of the 45 original length makes quite a big difference to the feel of it. And it does become eerie and evocative and elegiac and all those things.
And the context, of course. In the same way
Absolutely.
that when we used to watch the Needing line on television, the Spartacus theme seemed like sea music. And it really did. I mean, it was perfect.
Yes.
These things can get associated. Now, the book is about a little bit more than simply the tune. You've sort of identified 5, I think, iconic symbols of the war and of the loss, and which are the Last Post bugle call, the 2-minute silence, the cenotaph, the unknown warrior, and the poppy. And in a way, the book is about all of those things, and also about the way they've come in and entered and changed their significance. And for you, it's quite importantly, it's a democratizing process, isn't it? From the way soldiers were viewed, sort of before the Boer War and the Crimean War, and how they came to be viewed in the course of the 20th century.
Yes, there's quite a strong strand in the book, I think, which is to do with the relationship between the civilian and the military world in Britain, particularly because Britain didn't have conscription. It was always a volunteer army. And Britain was always very suspicious of the army. From the Civil War onwards in the 17th century, there's this feeling that when the monarchy is restored, that the monarch shouldn't have an army at his disposal because it would be undemocratic. And therefore there is a resentment on the part of the civilian population towards the army.
Also, they were a bunch of ruffians for the most part.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, there was like was it a 20-year conscription or something? You'd go to the army.
Yeah, it was effectively you're committing yourself pretty much for life, and it tended to be within families that you would have generation after generation serving in the army, which meant that it was always quite a small army in Britain, and the number of families who are actually touched by it was very, very small, because most families simply didn't have anybody who ever served in uniform. And so there was a suspicion of the army, which lasted through certainly the Napoleonic Wars, to a certain extent into the Crimean War, but that's where it starts to change, largely because of war correspondents turning up and actually reporting on what life is really like, and people being horrified by the conditions the soldiers actually had to live and work and die in. And then obviously that comes to its culmination in the First World War when we have conscription
for the first time, yes,
and then everybody is touched by it, and from there onwards things are different. Even then, I think it still takes quite a while for it goes through phases. It's only recently that we've decided that army charities should be called Help for Heroes, and that all soldiers are heroes, for example. Very, very different perception of soldiers to the one that the Duke of Wellington had when he called his men the scum of the earth.
And among the democratisation is the wars had been thought of in terms of great victories and of generals. And generals would get a big funeral, but the idea of honouring an individual grunt soldier was a new thing by the.
Oh, it was very much so. I mean, yes, when you have a great victory over Napoleon, then you erect Nelson's column to celebrate the great admiral who led you. There's no recognition of the men who served under him. That doesn't turn up until the first war memorials to actually list individual men is the Crimean War, but it's really the Boer War where that takes off in a big way.
And that brings us to the cenotaph, which is this radically different approach to military deaths. And in terms of, well, it's nature. I didn't realise it was a temporary one, like the Eiffel Tower.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it was built for a single event for one day.
So we'll
only.
stick it in Whitehall, and then we'll take it away, because who wants it in Whitehall? Yeah. It's a thoroughfare.
And it was not for Armistice Day, which is always an interesting development. I think that it was created for the Great Victory Parade in July 1919 that followed the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Because again, these just as the war memorials are a different way of commemorating the dead, the idea of commemorating the end of a war when the guns stop firing, this is a very new development as well. Previously, we celebrated the great victory. I mean, people throughout the 19th century knew when Trafalgar Day was. They knew when Waterloo Day was. Nobody paid any attention to the day that Napoleon surrendered to the British or the day that Napoleon abdicated as emperor, when it was actually the end of hostilities, effectively, because that was the end of the threat. And so there's a new development there in the end of the First World War, where people started they want to commemorate the day that the guns stopped firing.
And as you say, the mass of population has a much bigger stake in this, because every community has been touched by the deaths. And what you find, and what you make very clear in the book, is that the government keeps trying to push things in an official, state-oriented direction, and keeps having to bow to the wishes of the people in what they want. And like the cenotaph, and having the celebration at the cenotaph. They wanted to move it to Trafalgar Square at one point.
Well, it was. They started in 1919, Armistice Day. There were no plans at all until a couple of weeks before the anniversary itself, and then they thought they might have something, and the 2-minute silence was introduced, and then that was so powerful that the following year it was repeated. But in 1923, for the first time, Armistice Day fell on a Sunday, and then there was a conflict, because there had always been, on the Sunday closest to Armistice Day, there had been a service in Westminster Abbey, and it was considered that was the senior service, if you see what I mean.
Because
that is the official statement.
And Armistice Day was relatively secular.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cenotaph is very, very deliberately secular. It's non-denominational, it's non-religious, it has no religious inscriptions upon it at all.
We should say it was designed by Lutyens, of course.
Of course, yeah, which is one of the reasons.
The preeminent.
He is the greatest architect,
of his
time, possibly ever in Britain. And it is one of his finest works. I mean, it is a beautiful, simple statement that requires no adornment, and has none. And because Lutyens himself was fairly non-denominational in his religious approach, he insisted that there should be no religious inscription upon it. and it exists as the People's Monument. As I said, it was intended just for that one victory parade. The people demanded that it become permanent, and it had to be remade, because originally it was made out of plaster and wood, and then it's constructed in exactly the same style. I mean, it was no change to the design, but made out of marble and becomes a permanent institution.
You've got a lovely illustration in the book, because there are lots of posters and things of an advertisement for a little model cenotaph.
A cenotaph in every home
that you could send away for 5 shillings or 10 shillings or something, and have your own cenotaph.
Yes, 10 inches high.
Be lovely, a tiny little wreath maybe.
Yeah, and made in. I think it's something like marbeline, which is clearly a plastic that resembles marble, they argue.
I sort of want one. I mean, it'd be a bit kitsch. It wouldn't be very respectful.
No.
But I want one to go with, like the plastic Last Supper you might have next to it.
It has that sort of element. And I guess that's part of the period as well, is that on the one side you have the government trying to make everything about victory and triumph, the people who wish to mourn, and then commercial elements who are trying to find an angle somewhere in the middle of this. And yes, the cenotaph for every home is one of those attempts.
You are fantastically good company in this book, telling all sorts of these little stories and showing the development of things. I was very interested, much more interested than I would have expected to be, in the origins of the British Legion. Tell us where that came from.
Well, there were... Towards the end of the war, organisations started to spring up for ex-servicemen, and particularly disabled ex-servicemen. And when the war ended, there were several of these organisations, and they ranged in their attitude really quite widely, from some fairly conservative officers' associations through to some very radical left-wing groups that included large numbers of communists. This is, of course, in the immediate aftermath not only of the war but of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And there is a great fear amongst the establishment at this stage that they don't really quite know what to do about this. There is massive unemployment amongst ex-servicemen. There are millions of them have returned home, many of them with weapons. They're all trained to use weapons, or large numbers of them, but many of them actually do have weapons, because the process of demobilisation was so chaotic that people came back with rifles. And the idea that you had potentially a left-wing force in the country that could be armed and that was campaigning for the nationalisation of land, for example, and was in support of the Irish campaigners who were waging a civil war against Britain and fighting for independence at the time. This is very serious stuff, and the British Legion was largely created to bring all those organisations together into a single body and to strip out all the left-wing elements from it.
By Douglas Haig,
Douglas Haig created
great
it,
general.
and in his last speech before he died in the late 1920s, he claimed that he had averted revolution by creating the British Legion. As far as he was concerned, this was a genuinely possible revolutionary moment.
He might have been slightly overstating it, but he thought so.
I think he probably was, but his perspective was not unique. Winston Churchill at the time was arguing pretty much the same, that this is very dangerous. There was a real fear in Britain that the example of the Russian Revolution might be copied, and that ex-servicemen would be at the head of it. And once they started to make connections with the trade union movement, this was considered very, very dangerous indeed, and the British Legion was, to a large extent, intended to neuter that threat. And it did it incredibly effectively.
The book is called The Last Post, and it's subtitled Music, Remembrance and the Great War. And of course, the Great War is the phrase. My 10-year-old daughter asked me the other day, when did they start calling it the First World War, Daddy? And I said, well, round about the Second one, darling. How did the Second War change the perceptions of the armistice and of the relative peace following the First World War?
Well, I think it had evolved anyway. By the beginning of the 1930s, people were starting to see Armistice Day not simply in terms of commemoration of the great losses that had been suffered, but also as a token of future peace. That this was in many places was celebrated as Peace Day. The idea was that this was building for the future, and of course, the First World War has this legacy that is so terrible that people feel we should never repeat this, and that had become the dominant strand. And then the Second World War puts an end to that, and it becomes clear that this is simply about remembrance. This is about commemorating the dead.
And that tune, having preceded the war, has then got this universal application. It's used for non-military. You mentioned lots of people whose funeral it's played. Nellie Melba and
Wallace Hartley of the bandmaster of the Titanic, who had no military connections. Even before the First World War, it was being used for civilians like that.
And the Irish hunger striker Bobby Sands.
Absolutely. Well, it has now become this extraordinary international institution.
And it's gone all around the world. Almost everybody except the Americans.
Yeah, who have a very,
Taps.
very good version themselves,
Yeah.
Taps, which is emerges almost the same time. But I think the most extraordinary still seems to me that it was played at the funeral of Gandhi, a man who had devoted his entire life to fighting for non-violence and to ridding India of the British Empire. His ashes are scattered on the sacred waters of the Ganges to the sound of the last post, a British Army military bugle call. And this is an extraordinary development, that it has become so far removed from its roots that it is now just an expression of mourning.
It is, and it's also a very good book. Alwyn, that's lovely. The Last Post, Music, Remembrance and the Great War, is out now. It's $14.99, which is a good price, from Aurum Press. And it's a beautiful book as well. It's physically a very attractive
It's very nicely
piece.
designed, I think. Yeah.
Alwyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.